Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Ion Fury, formerly known as Ion Maiden, that is currently available for PC, but a console version is supposedly in the works. This is a first-person shooter developed by Voidpoint LLC and published by 3D Realms in August of this year for PC, but it's supposed to be coming out on console later on. We just don't have an exact release date yet. And while the game is technically a prequel to the twin-stick shooter Bombshell, you don't really need to have played that to understand anything that's going on in this, and in fact you may just not want to bother with that particular game at all. As for this game, it's interesting for a few reasons, the first of which being that it is the first game to run on the build engine since World War II GI was released back in 1999. Now of course technically the game is not running on the original version of the build engine that was used in those classic first-person shooters like Duke 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood. It's instead running on the eDuke32 source port, which means that it's capable of actually quite a lot more than what was present in those classic shooters. As for how that actually works out in-game, I'll talk about that in a moment. But the other major interesting thing about the game before we even start getting into anything else is that the game was threatened with a lawsuit by Iron Maiden because they thought that the original title of Ion Maiden as well as some of the imagery in the game threatened their trademarks somehow. It's pretty ridiculous when you get down to it, but the major result of that is that it was renamed to Ion Fury, and that's pretty much it. But the ultimate question with Ion Fury is whether it manages to hold its own in comparison to those classic build engine shooters like Duke 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood, or if it just ends up being another retro throwback shooter in a growing pond of retro throwback shooters. Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now, this being a build engine game means that the game is composed entirely of 2D sprites as well as voxels, and the voxel tech in this is noticeably improved over that of the original versions of the build engine, for example with Blood and of course Shadow Warrior, which of course means that the voxels in this look noticeably more detailed and just flat out better than the voxels did in those classic build engine shooters. Similarly, the sprite work in this is noticeably higher quality than that of the classic build engine shooters, but that's pretty much to be expected. When you're able to run on much higher resolutions and have much higher resolution sprites, of course they're going to be higher resolution and more detailed. But even that obvious trait aside, the actual sprites themselves look quite excellent. They are very detailed, the animations are generally pretty smooth, all things considered, and you end up with some very nice looking cyberpunk aesthetics going on in this game. And when you combine that solid aesthetic with the strong sprite work and voxel work, you end up with visuals that, if you're familiar with the build engine at least, are actually fairly impressive, and it really helps that the attention to detail in the level design is really second to none, even compared to other build engine games. The level designers just went out of their way to make sure that every single level is absolutely packed with detail, and given that the levels themselves are absolutely gigantic, that's pretty impressive. Now of course your mileage is going to vary depending on how much you appreciate the retro aesthetic, but generally speaking they've very much knocked it out of the park as far as the visuals are concerned. And then you move over into sound design and things are still very solid there as well. The sound effects generally work out very well, although the gun and explosion sounds do lack some of that bass kick I'd really like, but they still have a decent amount of punch to them. Meanwhile, the music feels like it was ripped straight out of the 90s, and unlike in the old school shooter style where it was usually MIDI tracks, the music in Ion Fury is actually all tracker stuff, so it actually sounds quite a bit more crisp and more synthy than what you would hear from a MIDI track, and it ends up actually working out very well in the game's favor. And then of course there's the voice acting, which is admittedly rather limited in scope. You have the enemy call-outs and yells and groans and screams and that sort of thing, and all of that works out okay and is fairly cheesy and fitting 90s FPS style. But then there are the two main characters that you will actually hear voiced lines from the entire game. Those are Shelley Harrison herself, played by Valerie Aram, and the evil Dr. Heskell, played by John St. John. And both of them are just hamming up their roles entirely, with every single line they're saying being completely ridiculous, and in Shelley's case, a lot of it being just pop culture references. In a fashion fitting for the likes of the classic build engine shooters, most notably Duke Nukem 3D, of course, Shelley is constantly spouting lines from various movies, TV shows, all that sort of thing. Although some of the choices for the lines are a bit odd, like the the, oh my god, the quarterback is toast, which is just an odd thing to say, period, let alone in a first-person shooter. Regardless, the voice acting in general does fit in very well with that build engine style, and the entire presentation when you bring it together definitely feels like a game from the 90s on steroids. But here's the thing, as strong as the presentation is, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, although this being a 90s style first-person shooter means that there's basically no story to speak of. When you start the game up, it gives you a very brief comic book-esque slideshow cutscene of sorts that gives you a very basic premise. The idea is that Dr. Haskell is completely insane and his cyborg armies are ultimately attacking the city of Neo-DC in the grim dark future. And they initiate their attack as Shelly Bombshell Harrison is in a bar trying to unwind with a crappy watered down drink that their attack ends up making her spill. So she decides that it's only fair if she spills their blood for spilling her drink. And that's really all there is to the story. It never gets any more complicated than it's up to Shelly to stop the evil Dr. Haskell from taking over the city. Of course, if this were a story-driven first-person shooter, then that would certainly be a problem, but this isn't a story-driven first-person shooter. It is a gameplay-driven first-person shooter. So that of course brings up the question of what exactly is on offer here. Well, it is an old-school inspired first-person shooter that takes place across 7 episodes, so to speak, and you have a variety of levels within those episodes. As you progress through the various levels, you'll be hunting down various key cards that will allow you to access certain areas, and you'll also be able to mow down enemies in your path with a variety of weapons that are mostly fairly mundane, although you do have some interesting standouts, like the basic pistol, which is called the Lover Boy, and it's actually a 3-barreled revolver that fires 3 bullets at a time, and you have a secondary fire of being able to lock onto enemies' heads and instantly shoot them in the head. Aside from that, you get a shock baton as your basic melee weapon. Your shotgun is called the Disperser and can switch between shotgun shells and grenade shells. You have a submachine gun that fires incendiary rounds, and the secondary fire is pulling up a second one, so you're firing them akimbo. There's a chain gun that you'll get at the very end of the first episode, in which you'll have surprisingly limited ammo for the rest of the game, but is admittedly as satisfying as a chain gun can really be. You eventually get access to something called the Ion Bow, which fires a single bolt in the primary fire, and if you hold down the secondary fire, it can charge up to fire up to 5 in a line pattern, or if you hold the button down even further, then it goes into overcharge and just fires out a massive barrage of bolts in a very rapid succession. Then there's something called the Cluster Puck, which I didn't really use all that much, but if you use the primary fire, it just throws out and it's basically a disc grenade. And if you use the secondary fire, then it shoots out a bunch of smaller munitions that cause a wide area explosion. Then there's arguably the most useful weapon in the entire game, which is the seeker grenades known as bowling bombs, which you can throw with the primary fire to seek into enemies, and if you use the secondary fire, you actually light the fuse on it and throw it as a just standard timed grenade. Now, I didn't get too much use out of the secondary fire, but the primary fire of that, where it homes in on enemies, is extremely useful, and you'll be using that throughout the entire game. It's one of the more satisfying weapons to use, in fact. But if you look at the entire lineup of weapons, you notice that there's not really a whole lot going on there. Sure, they're functional and they work very well for the most part, and they are satisfying to use, but there's nothing like, say, the Shrink Ray from Duke Nukem 3D, or the Ripper Head from Shadow Warrior, or even half of the arsenal from Blood. It's all fairly mundane, and you've got 2 slots being occupied by the Disperser, with 1 slot being the shotgun rounds and the other slot being the grenade rounds, and if you swap between them while you have the Disperser out, all you do is just go through the secondary fire animation, and if you have another weapon equipped, then you just swap to the Disperser with whatever rounds you decided to equip. So while that is a bit disappointing, it's definitely not a deal breaker. The other equipment you'll be using primarily consists of the 2 items that you can actually have in your inventory, unlike in previous build engine games, where your inventory would hold multiple items that you could scroll through and use whenever you needed to, like a portable medkit or the Hollow Duke or something along those lines, whereas in this, you only get 2 of those, which are the portable radar, which pops up a small radar that shows you where the enemies are, and the portable medkits, which unlike in previous build engine games are not simply one item that you have in your inventory, you actually can hold up to 10 of those, same with the portable radars, and you can use those whenever you want. Then of course there are power-ups that are scattered around the levels that will give you things like damage boosts or infinite bowling bombs, which is just completely ridiculous, or even something simple like jump boots, and those all have their own uses in the areas that they spawn in. They all activate immediately upon being picked up, and they last for only a few seconds, but those few seconds that they do last are quite useful, so if you see one, you might want to hold off on picking it up until you're sure you absolutely need it. And you'll be making use of all of the aforementioned weapons, equipment, and power-ups to eviscerate hordes upon hordes of foes, from basic cultists wielding rifles, all the way up to hulking mechanized monstrosities, each with their own attack patterns and their own threat levels. And unlike in classic build engine games, this actually has some degree of location-based damage. Basically, if you get headshots, it does a hell of a lot more damage, and of course, if your headshot manages to do enough damage to kill that particular enemy, more likely than not, it's going to blow their head off in a shower of blood and gore. This in particular is why the Lover Boy ends up being incredibly useful throughout the entire campaign, not simply being a fallback whenever you're running out of ammo with anything else. And of course, it's also useful for taking out enemies that are particularly difficult to track with other weapons, so you can just lock on to them and immediately get some headshots in to do some very large amounts of damage to that particular enemy before they become a problem. And that sort of thing does really spice up the combat quite a bit, because even though this is definitely an old school inspired first-person shooter through and through, and it definitely adheres to a lot of the same design principles as those classic shooters, particularly with things like the enemy placement and of course enemy prioritization based on how dangerous they are, as well as constantly staying mobile and using appropriate weapons depending on what you're actually facing, it also has its own more modern twists on it that are really brought about more due to the advances in tech than anything else. This all results in extremely satisfying combat throughout the entire game, and on top of that, it's not just that the gunplay feels great, it's that the game is actually legitimately challenging on top of that. Now, I played through the game on the normal difficulty setting, but there are 2 difficulty settings higher than that, and even then, there were several times where if I wasn't really careful, I actually would get my ass handed to me in the campaign, even on the normal difficulty. And unlike in more modern games where a lot of the deaths don't necessarily feel fair, in this one they do, and they feel like you just could have played better instead of, well, crap, I guess I don't have the right upgrade for this, or something along those lines. And when you combine that general gameplay experience with the absolutely superb level design with attention to detail that is unrivaled even by other build engine games, frankly, you end up with a real recipe for success, although it's definitely not without its problems. I've already mentioned some issues with the arsenal just being slightly disappointing, but still very functional and fun to use, but there's also things like the level design, where even though it is certainly ludicrously complex and is really unrivaled by even other build engine games, unfortunately some of the levels do tend to drag on a bit and can actually become fairly tiresome to play through. But thankfully, levels like that are fairly few and far between. There are also a downright absurd amount of secrets in the game, to the point where a lot of them are so well hidden you would just never find them without a walkthrough. But to be fair, that's only a major issue if you're one of those kind of people who has to have 100% completion of every single game you own. In my case, I found quite a few of them, but I wasn't really going out of my way to find secrets and really only picked up on probably the ones that were the most obvious. Then of course, there are the boss fights, which, this being a build engine game and being inspired by the games like, say, Duke 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood, mostly just ends up being large enemies with very, very large health pools that you just have to wail on until eventually they go down. There's nothing particularly special about them, and in fact, in some of the bosses' case, they are really just beefed up versions of normal enemies to begin with, and so that ends up being somewhat disappointing there. In fact, there are only 2 bosses that you'll fight that are even somewhat different compared to all the other stuff, and those are the gunship, which you have to hit in certain weak spots in order to actually do any real damage to it, and the final boss, which is incredibly lame, and even though I won't spoil it for you, was just a massive disappointment to fight. In fact, it's so lame I'd hesitate to even really call it a proper boss fight at all, so there's that. All told, the campaign's length is a very respectable around 8 hours or so depending on your difficulty setting. At least it took me about 8 hours to complete, your mileage may vary. And once you get done with that, of course, you can go back through and play the campaign again and try to go for 100% completion. But aside from just going back and replaying the campaign again, there's not really a whole lot else on offer here. The game does come with 3 bonus maps, but one of those is just a basic wave defense mission where you have a chain gun with infinite ammo and hold off waves of enemies. One of them is just the preview campaign, which is admittedly a fair bit different than what you actually experience in the proper campaign, but it is still just the preview campaign, which is pretty short. And the last one is just the preview campaign, but you're playing through it with a maximum of 25 hit points and you have infinite bowling bombs as your weapon. So there's really not a whole lot going on with those bonus maps at all. Now, of course, they are working on getting some degree of level editing capabilities and, of course, Steam Workshop support in there, but that's not in the game as I'm making this review right now, so your mileage is a bit limited on this. But to be fair, they are selling the game at a $25 US price point, which is very reasonable, all things considered. For the experience you're getting here, it's well worth the $25 cost of admission, especially knowing that proper mod support is on the way, and the fact that it's the build engine means that the mods can be pretty extensive, and the build engine has more or less been figured out, so the modders out there that would be working on it have every opportunity to do all kinds of crazy things with it. So we'll just have to wait and see how all the modding stuff goes with this, but as for the game itself, it is a fantastic first-person shooter that stands shoulder to shoulder with the classic build engine greats, Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood. Although it's definitely still not quite as good as them. Don't get me wrong, it's a very finely tuned, extremely well-crafted game, but it just doesn't have quite the same personality that those classic games did. But while that does hold it back from being an absolute must-own for literally anybody, it is still a must-own if you're into first-person shooters at all, and especially if you're into classic first-person shooters. Although even if you're not necessarily into classic first-person shooters, this is still a pretty decent starting point, although I would say that it'd still be better to play Duke Nukem 3D before you go into this, because this game does owe so much of its lineage to Duke 3D, and you'll really get the best experience having played that before going into this. Still, this is again an absolutely fantastic game that is a must-own for any fan of the genre. I give it a 4.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.